Allegheny Plateau, Pennsylvania, October, 1876. The air held the first sharp promise of frost, a clean, cutting edge that stripped the final stubborn leaves from the oaks. On a slope overlooking a shallow creek, Lars Nyström was doing something that made no sense. He wasn't clearing a plot or laying a foundation. He was attacking the largest fallen tree in the valley, a colossal red oak, 5 feet thick at its base, toppled by a summer windstorm, not with a saw to break it down for timber, but with an adze and auger to hollow it out. The work was slow, a rhythmic chunking of steel against ancient heartwood that echoed strangely in the quiet woods. For weeks, the other settlers had watched him. They had seen him and his small family, his wife Elin and their 2 children, Oscar and Ingrid, struggle through their first winter in a hastily built cabin, and they had offered pity. Now, they offered only ridicule. Abel Rourke, the best ridge builder in 3 counties, stopped his wagon on the track above Lars's claim. He was a man whose certainty was as solid as the foundations he laid. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that froze almost before it hit the ground. "Still at it, Nyström?" he called down, his voice thick with condescending authority. "You mean to live in that rotting log? It'll be a damp grave come January." With him were Caleb Finch, the sawyer, and Jedediah Stone, a farmer whose hands were permanently curled from a lifetime of work. Finch shook his head, a professional offense taken. "The heartwood's already going punky in the center. See the color of them chips? He's carving himself a mushroom farm. It's a fool's errand." "More work than building a proper cabin twice over," Stone added, squinting at the pile of wood chips that was now taller than Lars's son. "And for what? To live like a badger in a burrow? It's foolishness." Lars paused, leaning on his adze. He was not a large man, but his shoulders and arms were dense with the specific muscles of his trade. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a woody-smelling glove and looked up at the men. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply said, "The wind will not find my children this winter." Rourke laughed, a short, barking sound. "The wind won't have to. The damp and the rot will do the job for it. I wouldn't haul a single board for you to fix that thing, Nyström. It's a death trap." He slapped his reins, and the wagon creaked away, leaving the 3 words to hang in the cold air. Foolish, fools, foolishness. The mockery lasted for the rest of the autumn. The validation would last for a generation. What did this quiet Swedish log scribe understand about the physics of heat and air that these expert American builders, with all their practical frontier experience, had so profoundly missed? If you stay with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle that governs why your house is cold, why a wool sweater works, and why the stillest air is the warmest blanket nature ever created. It's a story about a man who didn't fight the cold, but simply built a place where it could not travel. To see more stories of ingenuity against the odds, consider subscribing to this channel. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution to a common problem you've ever seen? Lars Nyström was not a carpenter, not in the way the men on the Allegheny Plateau understood the term. He didn't think in terms of posts and beams, studs and siding. He was not a farmer, attuned to the soil and the seasons. He was a scribe, a log scribe from the dense, wind-scoured forests north of Uppsala in Sweden. His life's work, before coming to America, had been to walk into a forest of ancient pines, select trees with unique and challenging curves, and scribe them to fit together so perfectly that a piece of paper, let alone a breath of wind, could not pass between them. His tools were not just saws and axes, but compass-like scribers with twin steel points, broad-bladed carving axes, and a deep, almost reverent understanding of the grain and soul of a log. He had worked on hunting lodges for barons and great halls for landowners, places where the Baltic gales screamed for 6 months of the year. His trade was not about building walls. It was about defeating wind. He had brought his wife, Elin, and their children, 7-year-old Oscar and 5-year-old Ingrid, to America for the promise of land, a piece of the world that would be entirely their own. They arrived in Pennsylvania with little more than his tools, a chest of linens, and a quiet determination. Their first cabin was built in a hurry as the autumn of 1875 closed in. It was a standard frontier affair, green logs, hastily notched, with gaps chinked with mud and moss. It was, by the local standard, a decent enough shelter. But the local standard was no match for the Allegheny winter. That first year had been a lesson in misery, a long, slow education in the ways heat is stolen from a home. The specific memories were etched into Lars like scars. He remembered the constant, insidious hiss of the wind through 100 unseen chinks in the walls. He remembered waking in the gray pre-dawn light to see their own breath smoking in the air inside the cabin, mingling with the wood smoke from the inefficient fireplace. He remembered the blankets on their beds, crusted with a delicate, beautiful, and terrifying layer of frost grown from their own respiration overnight. Elin was constantly heating stones and wrapping them in cloth to tuck into the children's beds, a battle she could never quite win. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that lived inside the walls with them. Lars had failed. His family was cold, and for a man whose entire identity was tied to creating warm, secure spaces, the failure was a profound shame. He vowed it would not happen again. The problem, as Lars came to understand it, wasn't the cold. The cold was just a state of being. The problem was the wind. The problem was air in motion. The conventional frontier cabin, for all its rugged charm, was a thermal catastrophe. Its failure was built into its very design, and that failure had a name: convection. The settlers of the Allegheny Plateau were masters of brute force against the cold. They built enormous fireplaces, burned prodigious amounts of wood, and accepted a state of constant drafty chill as a simple fact of life. They fought the cold by making a bigger fire. Abel Rourke's cabins were the best in the region. He used seasoned oak, dovetailed the corners with a craftsman's precision, and chinked his walls with a carefully guarded recipe of clay, horsehair, and lime. Yet even in his own home, the laws of physics could not be defied. The moment air is heated, it expands, becomes less dense, and rises. As it rises to the ceiling, it cools, becomes denser, and sinks back down the far walls. This creates a relentless, invisible loop, a current of air. This is convection. Now introduce dozens of tiny, inevitable gaps in the walls. A chink here, a gap in the floorboards there, a poor seal around a window frame. Each one of these is an invitation. The rising warm air creates a slight pressure difference, pulling cold, dense outside air in through the low gaps. This cold air then gets drawn toward the fire, heated, and sent on its journey to the ceiling, pushing more warm air out through the high gaps near the roofline. The cabin becomes a convection engine, a machine designed specifically to draw in the coldest air, heat it, and then exhaust it outside. The family huddles near the fire, roasting on one side and freezing on the other, while the furnace burns through a cord of wood a week, with 90% of that heat going straight up the chimney or being carried out by the drafts. Every flicker of a candle flame was a testament to this moving air, this river of heat loss. Lars watched his neighbors. He saw Jedediah Stone's family living their winter lives within a 10-foot circle of their hearth. He saw the women stuffing rags into window frames, and the men constantly replastering the chinking, fighting a war against 1,000 tiny breaches. They saw the problem as cracks in the wall. Lars saw the problem as the air itself. You couldn't defeat an enemy that was invisible and everywhere. You could only build a container it couldn't move through. And in the heart of that fallen oak, he saw the perfect container. The work began in September. The first task was to clean the log, removing smaller branches and peeling away loose bark. Then, he had to open it up. Using a long two-man saw with Elin on the other end, he cut 2 parallel lines down the length of the massive trunk, about 3 feet apart. This would be the entrance and the eventual floor. Prying that massive slab of wood and bark out was a week's labor, requiring levers and wedges and every ounce of their strength. With the belly of the great tree opened, the real work began, hollowing it out. He started with his biggest auger, drilling a series of deep, overlapping holes into the heartwood. Then he switched to the adze, a curved, axe-like tool. Standing inside the log, he chopped downwards, splitting out the drilled sections. The rhythm was hypnotic. Drill, chop, clear. Drill, chop, clear. The pile of red-brown chips grew into a small mountain. Oscar and Ingrid played on it, oblivious to the mockery of the passing wagons. The men who laughed at him saw a man digging a hole in a log. They didn't see the precision. Lars wasn't just removing wood, he was sculpting a space. He followed the grain, leaving the walls thick and uniform, about 1.5 feet of solid oak on all sides. He was careful to work around a section where the heartwood was, as Caleb Finch had noted, a bit punky. He didn't see it as rot. He saw it as nature having started the hollowing process for him. He cleaned it out, exposing the sound, lighter-colored sapwood. As the hollow grew, Abel Rourke made another visit. He stood with his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "That's a rotting log trap, Nystrom," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of community consensus. "The damp from the ground will wick right up into it. It'll never be dry. You and your family will be coughing your lungs out by Christmas." Lars paused his chopping, his face slick with sweat despite the autumn chill. He looked at Rourke, then at the log, then back at Rourke. "The ground will not touch the inside," he said, and turned back to his work. The finality of the single quiet sentence was more powerful than any argument. The next step was to seal the ends. He didn't use crude planks. He went into the woods and found 2 trees with natural curves that matched the semicircular openings of the hollow log. This was his old-world skill, made manifest. He brought the curved logs back and began to scribe them. He placed a log against the opening, then used his 2-pointed scriber to trace the exact, irregular contour of the hollow oak onto the new piece. One point of the tool rode along the oak, the other scratched a perfect mirror image onto the ceiling log. Then, with a carving axe, he meticulously hewed to the line, creating a joint so precise that when he hammered the piece into place it was nearly seamless. He did this for both ends, leaving a small framed opening in one for a door and in the other for a tiny window. The final, critical step was insulation. He rolled the massive, hollowed trunk onto a bed of flat stones, lifting it a few inches off the ground to create a capillary break, preventing the ground moisture Rourke was so worried about from wicking up. Then he and Aylin packed the space underneath with a dense mixture of clay and moss. Along the top, where the cutout section would be replaced to form the roof, he laid down a thick layer of dried moss before carefully lowering the great slab back into place. Finally, using earth dug from the hillside, they banked the soil high up against the sides of the log, covering it almost completely, leaving only the scribed ends and the roof exposed. Elin stood back, her hands on her hips, looking at the result. It barely looked like a home. It was a mound of earth, a part of the hill itself with 2 strange wooden faces. "It looks like a sleeping beast, Lars," she said, her voice a mix of wonder and worry, "but I pray it sleeps warmly." Inside, the space was small, a long, curved tunnel about 20 feet long and 6 feet wide. The air was cool and still, and it smelled of fresh-cut oak and damp earth. It was a cave. It was a burrow. It was, Lars believed, the answer. To understand why Lars Nystrom was right and Abel Rourke was wrong, you have to understand the primary way a house loses heat. It's not just through the walls, and it's not just up the chimney. The greatest thief of warmth in any shelter is convection. It is the movement of air. Heat itself can move in three ways: conduction, radiation, and convection. Conduction is heat transfer through direct contact. Touch a hot stove, and the heat conducts into your hand. This is why a thick log wall feels colder than a thin piece of wood. The sheer mass of it conducts heat away from your body faster. Radiation is heat moving as electromagnetic waves. This is the warmth you feel from the sun or standing near a fire without touching it. But convection is the king of heat loss in a frontier home. Imagine a single cubic foot of air inside a cabin, warmed by the stove to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That cubic foot of air contains a specific amount of heat energy, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs. Now imagine a tiny crack in the wall. A draft blows that warm cubic foot of air outside and replaces it with a cubic foot of air at 0 degrees. All the BTUs you spent your firewood to create have just been physically carried out of your house. Every draft you feel is a river of BTUs flowing away from you. This is why a simple wool blanket keeps you warm. The wool itself isn't warm. Its power lies in its millions of tiny fibers, which trap air in small pockets. This air is held still. It cannot move. It cannot form convection currents. This trapped, still air is one of the best insulators on the planet. Your body heat warms that trapped air, and because it can't move, it stays next to you, a buffer against the colder air outside the blanket. Lars Nystrom's hollow log was not a house. It was a giant wooden blanket. The 1.5 feet of solid oak on all sides provided immense thermal mass, meaning it could absorb and hold a great deal of heat. But its true genius was in the air it contained. Once he sealed the ends and installed a small, well-fitted door, the air inside had nowhere to go. There were no chinks, no floorboard gaps, no poorly fitted window frames. The small stove he installed, with a narrow pipe running through a tightly sealed hole in the roof, created a tiny bit of airflow, but it was nothing compared to the raging convection engine of a conventional cabin. When he lit a fire, the air inside would warm up, but unlike in Rourke's cabin, it wouldn't immediately start a massive, swirling loop that pulled in cold from the outside. The air would warm, and then it would simply stay warm. It became the insulator. Lars had created a nearly perfect convection trap. The packed earth on the sides and the thick wood of the log itself would stop the wind from touching the structure, preventing conductive heat loss to the moving outside air. He had defeated the wind by making the air inside his prisoner. He wasn't just living in a log, he was living inside an insulator. That winter, the cold did not creep in. It descended like a judgment. In early January, a mass of Arctic air slid down from Canada and settled over the Allegheny Plateau. For 14 consecutive nights, the temperature dropped below -10 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless, cutting wind came with it, a wind that scoured the ridges and found every weakness in every structure built by man. It was a killer cold, the kind that claimed livestock and tested the very will to survive. Smoke from the chimneys of the settlement's cabins didn't rise. It was ripped from the flue and torn apart horizontally, vanishing instantly into the gray, churning sky. Inside the Stone family's cabin, life had shrunk to a desperate circle around the hearth. They burned wood constantly, a roaring fire that seemed to offer no warmth beyond arm's length. The wind moaned through the walls, an ever-present reminder of their vulnerability. They slept in their coats, huddled together for warmth. In Abel Rourke's home, the finest built cabin in the area, the fight was just as desperate. Rourke, proud and stubborn, refused to admit defeat, but he spent his days stuffing more rags around his window frames and his nights feeding log after log into his great stone fireplace. The windows were opaque, covered in a thick, feathery layer of frost that grew from the moisture of their own breath freezing on the inside of the glass. The cold was winning. But in the strange earth-banked log on the hillside, a different reality existed. The first night the cold snap hit, Lars lit a small fire in the tiny cast-iron stove. He used only a few pieces of well-seasoned hickory. The interior of the log warmed slowly, steadily. The curved oak walls soaked up the radiant heat, and the still air inside grew warm and stayed that way. By evening, the temperature inside was a steady 68 degrees. Outside, it was -12 with a wind that drove the chill factor down to something unthinkable. The contrast was not just in numbers, it was in the quality of life. Elin sat near the middle of the room, far from the stove, mending one of Oscar's socks by the light of a single tallow candle. The air was so profoundly still that she could hear the gentle, rhythmic pop of the thread pulling through the wool. There was no other sound. The screaming of the wind outside was completely absent, muffled by 1.5 feet of oak and 3 feet of packed earth. It was a pocket of impossible silence and calm. Oscar and Ingrid were asleep in their small beds, wearing simple nightshirts, their faces flushed and peaceful. On a small table, a pat of butter sat in a dish, perfectly soft. In Rourke's cabin, a similar dish of butter was frozen as hard as a rock, even just a few feet from the fire. The single pane of glass in Lars's small window was perfectly clear, a dark, clean eye looking out at the maelstrom. Through it, he could see the swirling snow, a world of violent motion he could observe, but not feel. They were not surviving the storm. They were simply living as if it did not exist. The vindication came on the 5th day of the cold snap, not through argument or demonstration, but by accident. One of Abel Rourke's prized hogs, driven half mad by the cold and a desperate hunger, broke through its pen. Rourke, bundled in every layer he owned, chased it. The hog, a black bristling creature, scrambled across the iron-hard ground, heading straight for Lars's property. Rourke was a strong man, but the cold was draining him. The air burned in his lungs. His beard was a solid mass of ice. He was cursing the hog, the cold, and the world in general when he finally cornered the animal near the side of Lars's strange, buried log home. He lunged, slipped on a patch of ice, and fell against the curved wall of the oak to keep his balance. He braced himself for the impact, expecting to feel a deep and penetrating cold, the frozen heart of a massive dead tree. His experience taught him that a solid object that large, exposed to this weather for days, would be a block of absolute cold, capable of stealing the heat from his body in an instant. But what he felt was nothing. Through the thick layers of his wool coat, there was no shock of cold. There was just the solidness of wood. Puzzled, he pulled off his mitten and pressed his bare, freezing hand flat against the rough bark of the log's exposed roof. It wasn't warm like a stove, but it was utterly, impossibly free of frost. It felt like a piece of wood on a mild autumn day. He stared at his hand, then at the log. It made no sense. He looked at the small stovepipe sticking out of the roof. There was no smoke, not a wisp. He concluded the Nyström's fire must have gone out, that they were freezing to death inside, and a pang of guilt mixed with his grim satisfaction. Just then, the small, sturdy door opened. Lars Nyström stepped out, holding a wooden bucket. He wore a simple shirt, his sleeves rolled up. He didn't even seem to notice the cold. He saw Rourke and the hog and nodded a greeting. Rourke, his mind reeling, could only stammer, "Your fire. Is it out? Do you need help?" Lars looked at him, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "The fire is small, but it is enough. Please, come in. You look cold." Rourke hesitated, then his curiosity overwhelmed his pride. He tied the hog to a nearby sapling and followed Lars to the door. As Lars pulled it open, Rourke braced for a wave of frigid air from the dark interior. Instead, he was met with a gentle, unmoving warmth. It wasn't the scorching, drafty heat of his own fireplace, but a steady, uniform comfort that filled the entire space. He stepped inside, the door closed, and the world went silent. The howling of the wind vanished completely. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. He saw Elin and the children, comfortable and calm. Then he saw the proof. On the small table in the center of the room sat a candle. Its flame was a perfect, unwavering teardrop of light, so still it looked like a painting. Lars saw where he was looking. Without a word, he picked up a second unlit candle, opened the door, and stepped back out into the maelstrom. Rourke watched through the doorway as Lars cupped his hands and lit the wick. The instant the flame caught, the wind seized it, ripping it sideways into a frantic, sputtering flag of light. It lasted less than 3 seconds before it was extinguished. Lars came back inside, closing the door on the roaring wind. He placed the unlit candle back on the table. Beside it, the other flame continued its placid, perfect burn. In that moment, Abel Rourke understood everything. It wasn't about the size of the fire. It was about the stillness of the air. He looked around the curved, womb-like space, at the solid wood glowing faintly in the candlelight, at the peaceful family living in a pocket of calm in the heart of a tempest. He shook his head, not in disbelief, but in awe. "You didn't build a cabin," he said, his voice quiet with revelation. "You built a calm." The conversion of Abel Rourke was total and immediate. When the cold snap finally broke, he didn't just stop mocking Lars. He became his most vocal advocate. The first people he told were the foremen of the logging camps in the high ridges. These camps were notoriously hard places, and the flimsy, draft-ridden bunkhouses they threw up were breeding grounds for pneumonia and misery. Men were getting sick, and a sick logger couldn't work. It was an economic problem. Rourke, using his authority as a builder, explained the principle. He didn't talk about physics. He talked about results. "The Swede's family isn't cold," he told them. "He burns 1/10 of the wood and lives twice as warm." Intrigued, a foreman from the Black Creek Lumber Company visited Lars. He saw the still candle, felt the even warmth, and was convinced. They had dozens of massive, unusable hemlock and pine logs, felled and left to rot because they were too big to easily mill. The next week, a crew of loggers, under Lars's quiet direction, began hollowing out a 40-foot pine. It was rougher than Lars's work, done with axes and brute force, but the principle was the same. They sealed the ends, banked it with earth, and moved 20 men into it. The result was revolutionary. For the first time, the men slept through the night without waking to shiver. The camp's wood consumption dropped by half. Sickness rates plummeted. By the spring of 1877, 3 other logging camps had built Nystrom logs for their bunkies. The idea spread not through newspapers or architectural plans, but through practical men telling other practical men what worked. It was a solution born of the forest, for the forest, and it was perfectly suited to the transient, resource-rich environment of the logging industry. Lars Nystrom never sought fame or payment for his idea. When people asked him how he did it, he would simply explain the importance of sealing the walls and trapping the air. He gave his knowledge away as freely as the forest gave its timber. What Lars had stumbled upon, through the lens of his ancient trade, was a principle that modern building science would not formalize for another century. His hollow, earth-banked log was a primitive form of a structural insulated panel, or SIP. The inner and outer walls of oak were the sheathing, and the trapped, still air was the insulating core. His careful scribing of the end caps and his tight-fitting door created an air barrier, a concept now central to energy-efficient construction. He had, without any formal training in thermodynamics, created a high-performance home. He proved that the battle against cold isn't won with a bigger furnace, but with a better envelope. The quiet competence of an old-world craftsman had effortlessly surpassed the brute force traditions of a new one. There is a simple truth at the heart of this story, a lesson written in oak and candle flame. Heat stays where wind finds no path. This is true for a house, and it is true for a life. The harshest forces are often not the direct blasts of crisis, but the small, persistent drafts of doubt, criticism, and convention. They are the tiny gaps in our conviction that drain our warmth and energy over time, leaving us chilled and fighting to feed a fire that can never burn hot enough. Lars Nystrom didn't argue with the mockers. He didn't try to shout down the wind. He simply picked up his tools and built a space where the wind had no purchase. He sealed the gaps. He understood that resilience is not always about strength, but about integrity, the quality of being whole, without cracks for the cold to seep through. He built a shelter for his family, but he also provided a model for a different kind of wisdom, one that doesn't fight the storm, but simply makes itself impermeable to it, creating a small, warm, and quiet place of its own, a calm. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found the principles of thermal science and the triumph of practical wisdom as fascinating as we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. Every subscription helps us to unearth and share these remarkable histories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building methods today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.